Welcome to the story of SKY GODZ. What is it all about? I'll tell you in a second. So finally, a two-part video series about the story, the actual storyline behind SKY GODZ. I'm going to talk about inspiration in part 1, and I'm going to talk about the actual happenings, characters, storylines in part 2. It's actually very important to talk about inspiration here because a lot of the topics basically that we discuss are going to be fairly philosophical. I mean, think about it. What is SKY GODZ really about? It's essentially about aliens coming to Earth, creating humans, therefore creating us. So that answers at least part of the question, where are we from? It doesn't answer all the questions. It doesn't answer the questions what we're here to do. It's another question, but at least it answers that part of the question. So it's one of the things that people have been thinking about for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, you think about it, every religion basically has its own creation myth, and that's exactly where the problem is. If you ask anybody in the street, well, where did it come from? Yeah, well, the religious people have it easy because they're going to be like, well, God created us. Well, the science people also have it easy because they're going to say, well, it just was evolution. It just happened to be that way. At some point there was a big bang and it just totally coincidentally, life was created on Earth. There was maybe a meteorite that brought some plants or whatever the hell they're talking about. And then we created ourselves basically crawling from a fish on land, becoming a monkey and eventually becoming human. I mean, completely ludicrous if you really think about it, just about as ludicrous as the God idea. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not pertaining here that anything is reality, I mean, I want to make it absolutely clear that SKY GODZ is completely fictional. It's a science fiction story that may have some validity in some regards, and all the inspirations that I'm going to be showing you today are literally inspirations. It is a work of fiction. I did not take anything from anywhere. There was maybe some kind of inspiration. Now, talking about inspiration is a tricky thing. For those of you know, I used to work for Marvel Comics at some point doing Spider-Man. Why did I want to do Spider-Man? Because it was nostalgia. It was something that inspired me to recreate my youth. Now, fortunately for me, I realized it very quickly and I got off it really within a couple of years, and I realized that this is going to be a go nowhere road. Just trying to constantly recreating your youth is not going to be any progress. Not going to make your life any better. You just constantly keep recreating that fuzzy feeling you had as a little kid. I mean, you think about it, most comic book artists, most pop culture entertainment is completely nostalgia driven these days. Good example is Star Wars. They have been trying to recreate the warm fuzzy feelings of the first trilogy now for what, 20 years? Have they succeeded? Well, I think most people would say no. But I was 10 years old when the first Star Wars film came out. I loved it. Obviously, as a 10-year-old kid, everybody would love it. But now the new stuff, I just can't get into it because, quite frankly, everything has been said in the first trilogy. There's no real reason, basically, other than nostalgia, trying to make more money, to keep going. So nostalgia is actually a real big problem, basically. And with inspiration, we want to be careful that we're not falling in a trap of trying to recreate our youth. Now, with a project like SKY GODZ, I mean, as I will show you in a second, there is no danger, basically, on trying to create my youth, basically, because I couldn't even perceive and conceive the kind of, like, sophisticated ideas that are in this show. Now, what is SKY GODZ really based on, basically? What is the main principal idea? The main principal idea is a theory called the Ancient Astronaut Theory, which was the basis for the Learning Channel program Ancient Aliens. It basically it says that there's a race of aliens. Obviously in SKY GODZ's case it was several races, but in most people, because most stuff is very narrow. As we will find out once we look at the books, I will show you. A lot of stuff is very, very narrow. And like for example, I give you a good example. My fellow Swiss contactee, Billy Meyer. For those of you who know a little bit about the UFO field, I'm sure you must know Billy Meyer. Billy Meyer is a contactee an alleged contactee. Basically, they had contact with the Pleiadians in the 70s, and he shot some really clear UFO footage, which of course, ends up being all fake, basically. But his agent, or his what do you call it, like his manager that goes basically around the podcast, Michael Horn, he still keeps saying to this day, literally last month, he kept saying, well, Billy was the only contactee. The Pleiadians are the only race that ever have any interaction with Earth, basically. Everybody else who says anything different is a liar and a fake. So, so there's a lot of those people that they get hung up on one idea, and they essentially just say, like, whatever, this is the only idea that's really valid. Everything else is basically bullshit. And of course, we all know that this is not true. By sheer mathematics, with the billions of planets that are out there, there's possible that there's just one race visiting, if anybody's visiting. However, this ancient astronaut theory basically was propagated like in the mid to late 70s. It became really, really popular basically with a guy, I'm sure you guessed it all, Erich von Däniken, another Swiss guy. Unfortunately, a real populist. Not much science there, basically. As a matter of fact, I don't own one single one of his books, basically. I just can't get myself to look at that stuff, really, because I've been reading lots of it on the internet. I've heard about people. I've been following his Twitter thing for a while, but I just... he's just a right-wing, alt-right, they're called alt-right populist, basically. That's what he really is, let's call it what it is, I don't know why occultism and right-wing politics are so hand in hand, it would seem that they're sort of like opposite, and that, like, people who are like open-minded into the paranormal, they would be like a little bit more open-minded in life, but that's simply not the case, However, Erich von Däniken did popularize the ancient astronaut theory, basically, and Chariots of the Gods, which was his first series, was really, really, really popular, probably because it was so simplistic, so it made a lot of sense to people. However, I do owe Von Däniken a little bit of a thank you, even if I don't like his books, don't have any of his books. When I was really little, maybe like about 10 years old or something like that, maybe 9 years old, 10 years old, there was a lot of comic books here in the newsstands. And because my parents didn't have a television, they said, you just buy whatever comics you want, we'll give you money. And one of the comics that they had is this series. You see Erich von Däniken in the top right corner here, basically. Actually, this was the first volume. This is actually a comic book series called The Gods from Outer Space. And then it says up here, based on Erich von Däniken. You see his name is huge, basically, on the cover. And this was a comic book series. This is sort of like, it's actually more like a graphic. It was kind of expensive at the time, I remember. It was like $4.80. Yeah, see, Deutschmark is the old German currency. It was kind of expensive for a little kid, basically. And when you think that an average comic book will cost maybe one Swiss franc or one Deutschmark 20, and this was like 4 Deutschmark. It was 4 times the cost of a comic. However, I did think the concept was really, really interesting. You see the artwork. It was drawn by a Serbian artist. It's it is what it is. It's pretty well drawn. It's capable. It's not the greatest art of all time. However, this was the first time basically that I heard of like aliens coming to Earth and sort of like, creating human beings. Now the point about this being that the series is not very good. The writing is really typical late 70s children's piss poor writing, sort of like it really doesn't make a point about anything, that there's no basis in mythology, as you will find out later, in this show. Basically, I'm very much interested in mythology, and I'm a big reader. I consider myself to be somewhat knowledgeable about world mythology, so everything that I'm incorporating in Sky Gods needs to have some kind of a background. I'm not just going to make up shit, basically, and just say, like, whatever, But this is one of those things. They sort of, literally just made everything up, There's a lot of biblical references in here. which of course, is the easy thing to do. I mean, everybody always goes to the Bible, and says, oh, Ezekiel's wheel, blah, 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 that means UFOs. No, it doesn't mean anything, really. Bible is a work, just as work as fiction as anything else. And basically, the real value of the Bible, if there's any value, it's a symbolism. I mean, you will see this in any kind of religious writing, in a world of religions, basically. This is not meant to be taken at face value. It's not meant to be taken seriously. This is all about symbolism, basically. So if you go in and say, oh, well, this really happened at really this point, you're probably doing yourself a disfavor. And I think that's the thing that they did with the series, that at the end of the day, it was just a hodgepodge of nothing. And also like the designs, for example, of the spaceships that these extraterrestrials, I think the planet was Delos that they came from, which actually is interesting, because this is a cross-reference to Richard Schaefer's Teros and Delos kind of thing, which I'm not sure if they were aware of that. So the spaceship that they came in looked like a 1960s rocket. And the bad aliens are insectoids. They're sort of like insectoid creatures. They're really immobile and really couldn't move at all, basically, because they were just too tall. And the whole thing was just basically a mess. And the bad guy was basically a scientist, the bad scientist who sort of manipulated things. I think that's an interesting concept. I'm definitely gonna I mean, that would have been my idea too. And as you will see in Sky Gods, we do have some scientists going amok, because it just offers itself, and it's a nice pun to the real world. Let's be honest. I mean, scientists are not holy people. There are people like you and me, and there's good and bad, and there's some people who will obviously abuse their powers. So this series, basically, other than really giving me some basic idea about the ancient astronaut idea, it's not really, like I said, there's not much really to take from, basically, and especially story-wise, absolutely nothing. It's just the idea that humanoid creatures walked on Earth and sort of created us. I mean, that's about the only thing that this has in common. This series was cancelled after 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 issues. That was all there was. It was published in Germany, France, and maybe a couple other European countries. Never went outside, never went to the US. I don't think it would have stood a chance, basically. So that's that. More importantly, and that's a really important book, Sirius Mysteries by Robert Temple. Now, this is a really interesting book, because this is actually a book that scientifically researched, and that actually got some acclaim in the scientific community. Came out, this is actually the first printing, came out about the same time as Von Däniken. Not quite as popular as Von Däniken stuff, mostly because it's a little too smart, I think. And it's a really good book. And Temple, basically, he doesn't look just at the general kind of thing. Däniken just kind of looked at everything and, and ended up with nothing, And he was very specific. He looked at the Dogon tribe in Mali. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with that situation, basically, is that the Dogon tribe is a tribe in Mali that has very intense rituals and cave paintings, and supposedly had knowledge of a dwarf star called Sirius B. That we don't even didn't know about until about like 40 years ago or 50 years ago, something like recently. And he sort of makes the case that because the Dogon tribes had this knowledge 3,000 years ago, that they eventually had been visited by these creatures from Sirius B. There was some sort of amphibian creature called the Nomo. And he goes in great detail, basically, in this book as to why that is, and how it all relates in terms of the languages and this and that. It's a very, very fascinating read. I mean, it's probably, I would say, hands down, probably the best book, on the ancient astronaut theory. Now, this has many times been reprinted. You can easily pick this up on Amazon. You don't have to pick up the first printing. There's paperback editions, Kindle editions, whatnot, basically. But that's definitely highest recommendation. I did make a comic version of the Nomo in sort of like a blackboard fashion a few years back. That was collected in a book called Bakuba about African folk tales. But I will definitely have some of the influences from that in Sky GODZ. So probably more like in a comic book series than the animation series, because this is literally, we're talking only about 3,000 years, you know, that these the Dogon have existed, have supposedly been visited, and we're going way back, you know, we're going back, you know, several 100,000 years. So that gives me a little bit of a time problem. Another major influence, of course, this is the one you will all recognize. Sakurai Sitchin series. The Ultimate Human Experience. These are just 2 books, basically, the 2 paperback books out of a series. I think it's called the Earth Chronicles, or the 10th. I think the first one was the 10th planet. I have them all, and yeah, I just keep occasionally looking at them. Now, Sakurai Sitchin was an interesting situation, basically, because he focused on the Sumerian civilization. You know, I mean, if you look at traditional history books, the Sumerians are essentially the ones that we all go back to and say, like, this is the first known writing that we have that's really coherent. You know, it's the first known recorded writing, you know, the Tower of Babel and blah blah blah. So it's sort of like, you know, in history books, it's sort of like the first acknowledged big civilization. And he basically goes and he takes those stone tablets and he sort of retranslates them, you know. I mean, again, extremely controversial material, you know. And what he came up with his retranslation is essentially this, that the Anunnaki, you know, there will be in Sky GODZ also be called Anunnaki. I kind of like that word, you know, I think it's interesting. It actually means those who came from the stars. And it's sort of like the Anunnaki, they came to Earth because their own planet was dying. Their own planet was dying because there's some kind of radiation nonsense, and they needed mostly gold on Earth to make a shield around their planet. And as a result of that, they created the slave race, human slave race, to mine the gold for them, and that's how the humans were created. Now, this never sounded right to me. You know, I mean, I'm not the only one. You know, obviously, this is complete, in my opinion, complete lunacy, that idea. You know, I do like the idea that the Anunnaki came to Earth, but the motive of creating a human race just to mine gold, and then they stayed here, and there's not really clear how. I mean, obviously there's some problems going on, like interbreeding and whatnot, you know, but there's a lot of things that are not really clear, and he sort of like tries to sort of hodgepodge this together and make sense out of it. And I think this book is about the Aztecs and the Toltecs, you know, which is kind of fascinating. But he pretty much ran out of ideas really quickly, and there's actually lots of websites out there that sort of like dispute this translation. And you know, I also have to agree. I think the whole thing is a little shady at best. But he definitely is a big name. I have been inspired by the fact that the Anunnaki, the Babylonian, Egyptian thing, of course, is a fascinating subject. But you know, so I've been sort of somewhat inspired by that, and but that's pretty much that's pretty much it. You know, I don't think there's too much more to get out of this. So the Bhagavad Gita, the Rig Veda, and the Ramayana are going to be a major influence, basically, and especially second, third season. We're not really going to get to this like in the first season, because the first season is really here basically to establish the main characters, create humanity, and sort of like establish the main framework. And the second season, you know, when things are not going to go well with Enki and Enlil, and they're going to split up, you know, then this is going to feature Major League in. Another book that was very important. Now this is a little strange one, basically. It's a very small publisher. I picked this up maybe a little 22 years ago in the US. This is a channeled book. Now, you know, channeling is a little tricky, you know, because obviously it's not scientific. You know, I mean, it could be just people making stuff up, basically. But in any case, whoever made this up made some pretty damn good story up, in my opinion. And this is sort of like the idea that that the Lyrans are sort of like the mastered creator consciousness race, basically, and there's this prism of Lyra that all the other races are fractured through, and basically this is the book where they're talking about like that all the wars of the galaxies, especially some of the villains of the universe, like the Alpha Draconians, for example, I mean, or the Kiatars, which are like the master race of the Draconians, so like 14 to 20 foot tall reptilian creatures with big wings and big tails. I mean, just imagining that basically, makes them look like super evil. But they have been around for a long time, and they've caused a lot of problems for a lot of races. And this is the sort of like this conflict of good and evil that we're still, that dualism that we're basically even, I mean, what we consider to be a conflict in every piece of pop culture literature, basically. This is sort of like a working this whole thing out, this galactic conflict that has been going on for billions of years. We're sort of like in a microcosm, we sort of have to work out on this planet. And that's sort of like, the overarching idea of what Sky GODZ is. We have the conflicts on Earth. Going to the minutest conflicts, we have the conflicts between the Anunnaki themselves, who are basically just about well, not just about, they're actually probably much more neurotic, than Woody Allen would have ever been, and they constantly keep arguing, they constantly keep fighting, they keep betraying each other. I mean, it's like all the things we're basically dealing with on this planet as humans, sort of like they already had. And then it sort of like goes up. Then we have the conflict between the Anunnaki and the other races. Not everybody likes that the Anunnaki have been able to do this genetic program on Earth, especially races that have been here for a lot longer. The Draconians have been here a lot longer. There's several reptilian races, for example, the Nagas, who one of the Anunnaki is actually going to team up. They have been underground, and we couldn't really live above ground. You got to imagine that too back at the time. I mean, it was just way too dangerous. So most of the stuff is happening underground. And there's lots of races basically that have been living underground, and then all of a sudden, the Anunnaki come and they create this genetic program which has been sanctioned by the Lyrans, so nothing really anybody could do about, and they were not happy about it. So maybe they couldn't have done anything right away basically, but sure as hell we're working on it. So you have that conflict, and then you have, of course, the larger conflict. You have the conflict between several planets. We're not confined to this planet, basically. So you have like it's like an onion peel, basically. And this book sort of like talks a little bit about that. It's a very fascinating read. A lot of the channel material I find kind of difficult to get into because it's essentially just like a love and peace kind of thing. I do like the Ashtar idea, and I'm actually going to incorporate that, but I like the fact that there's a galactic federation and that there is a commander, who's like sort of in charge, and I like the fact that the police have some sort of like a weird spiritual authority. I mean, Ashtar is essentially a very highly developed commander. He's not like a typical Anunnaki or Draconian sort of meanie. He's very highly he's a very highly spiritually evolved being basically. And at his disposals, the police cars of the universe, if you want so, are the Arcturian light ships. And you cannot mess with the light ships. There is no way. I mean, they're just literally. Everybody knows that. Even the Draconians know that, basically, which sort of like keeps them in check. I guess if that would not be there, I think they would have just been taking everything over. It would have been done, And then sort of like it gives it like a nice little balance, basically, that they know they can only go so far, and once they overstep their boundaries, it's gonna, it's gonna come down with fire and fury, to quote a little Trump thing here. He's going to come down on them basically, and really badly, and there's sort of like this whole balance that develops basically. I really want the show to be basically about this. As we get further in the show, of course, we're not going to get around talking about Atlantis and Lemuria. I mean, that's definitely a part of it. I mean, according to Sitchin and according to other legends, basically, sort of like you had this continent of Lemuria or Mu, I think Mu may even be like, it sort of depends on which book you're reading. This is the series by Church Ward. Church Ward has been given some knowledge by a Tibetan monk, and he's written several books basically about this. It's kind of fascinating stuff, but it's also, of course, it's sort of like walks in a channel territory. And Church Ward's dead now, but his son has been sort of can I say the word? Continuing the propaganda for his father's writings, and it's interesting stuff. I mean, I'm definitely gonna be somewhat inspired by this, but I like the idea that sort of like after Enki and Enlil really did not get along anymore, basically, and this sort of basic Anunnaki program has been shut down. They sort of like split up into those two territories. One of them was Lemuria, which was in the south tip of Sri Lanka, going all the way to Oceania, so like Australia, and that's going to be Enki's thing. Which is interesting because Enki's suit is blue, and the Indian god Rama is also blue. We have a lot of blue gods basically. So like when he got there actually, and when he built up Lemuria, he sort of like became the blue god. That's sort of like, that's how symbolically in the Hindu mythology it was translated basically as a blue god, but in reality it was actually Enki. Where Enlil went off in the other direction basically, making a pact with the Andean base, and creating sort of like Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean basically. And those two basically would essentially destroy each other at some point, and out of that sort of like became the Sumerian society and the Egyptian civilization. So you see how it all goes basically. So it's all going to be incorporated down the road. Obviously this is going to be epic series, and hopefully it will go on for a long time, but we're going to get to everything once everything is done. A couple general things about how I want to do things is that you really think about it. The more that I think about it, in the beginning I was sort of like the early sketches, they still had like spacesuits on, and it's sort of like I was caught like in a whole sci-fi realm kind of thing. But the more I think about it, it's like, if you're really a highly developed spacefaring race like the Anunnaki are, or like the Alpha Draconians, you're not gonna need any spacesuits. I mean, it's ridiculous basically. I mean, you really think about it, you're not going to travel in a ship from for several hundred thousands of light years to planet Earth. I mean, that's the one argument that a lot of the UFO skeptics always keep saying, is like, yeah, well, I mean, how could they come here? Sorry, I'm making the skeptic voice. How could they come here, if they were to travel all this distance in those little flying saucers or whatever? As nobody says that they're coming here in flying saucers. I mean, it's a ludicrous idea, basically. I mean, if you're that highly developed that you can genetically engineer beings, basically on a fly. I mean, it's not on a fly. They did have some problems, obviously, but if you have that technical ability, basically bending time and space, essentially, moving long distances, basically through portals, and we know the portal theory. This is gaining a lot of traction. I mean, even now, for example, with this New York Times disclosure thing, the word on the street is basically that what's really happening is the whole portal thing, that they're having some kind of portals, and that was already like a conspiracy theory in the Iraq War. Why did we really go into Iraq? Was it really to get rid of Saddam? No, it really wasn't, because a lot of artifacts were stolen, and according to some conspiracy theories, there was some Stargates type of technology stolen. I mean, remember, that's the old world. I mean, that's where it all happened, the Sumerian nonsense. And so portal theory, Stargate theory, all that kind of stuff, like the wormhole thing. I mean, if they came here so long ago and they were this advanced, that's how they would have traveled. They wouldn't have traveled in a flying saucer, wobbling through space several thousand light years. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. And then once you start thinking about this further, you also realize basically that everything else doesn't really make any sense. The whole Star Wars, Star Trek thing is basically completely ludicrous, basically, because you wouldn't have any spacesuits. You have mastered all that. It's really all about, at the end of the day, it's going to be all about consciousness. And a lot of people in the UFO field are starting to think more and more along those lines, basically getting away from the nuts and bolts kind of theory stuff. Sort of like, there's like the nuts and bolts, you know what I mean? It's just like a spaceship that's clobbered together with hammer and nails, and then, put a little fuel in it and you fly, you wobble around. None of that, basically. So it's completely consciousness-driven situation. And we do actually have some indication in the real world that this may really be the way it's going, basically. Because, like, for example, when Ben Rich was asked, I mean, again, this is sort of like third, like telephone game hearsay, basically. But supposedly, Chen Harsen, the UFO whatever chief in command right now, basically, he did ask Ben Rich after the guy of Lockheed Skunk Works. He asked him basically, well, but how does it really work? How does it work? And Ben Rich looked at him and said, "Did you ever hear of ESP?" He says, "Yeah, sure. This is how it works." So basically what he's basically saying is to forget about all the fuel, anti-gravity technology, all the stuff, that Bob Lazar is talking about with Area 51. It's all nonsense, essentially, So it really basically works with consciousness. And once I realized that this is the way that it basically had to be. I mean, it's like, quite frankly, I don't want to do another Star Wars type of thing. I mean, there's no point to it, basically. This has been done to death. This has been done very well. I mean, we don't need any more Battlestar Galactica. We don't need more Star Trek. We don't need any of that stuff, basically. So once I realized that, basically, I really wanted to go down the consciousness road, that I'm going to say, okay, good. Those people are those beings are so highly developed. They are so out there, basically, beyond anything we can even attempt to understand. Everything had to change. So those are some of the influences, some of the inspirations, basically. And I hope this was somewhat interesting for you. In the second part, I will actually talk literally step by step about the storyline, who are the main characters, who are the main players, what is actually happening, how is this going to develop. And I'm going to show you also like some sketches while I'm talking, basically, so you see exactly what I'm talking about. And so you have actually a pretty good idea. I'm not really too worried about like anybody stealing anything, I mean, as I said in my last video, as of the end of this month, the presentation documents are going to be pretty much out there available, so if you're smart, you pretty much will know how to find it. And I'm not really worried about it, because this is such a unique concept, unique project, basically, that I doubt that anybody else will really be able to cobble this together just like exactly in the same way that I would do this. So I'm not really too worried about it. I'm more worried about you getting interested in this. So when it finally, hits the streaming the streaming services or TV or whatever, basically, that you'll be there watching. Don't forget to subscribe, check down social media below, as always. And especially, I want to pimp this again, Instagram. Definitely follow Instagram. It's probably the most interesting, most exciting thing right now. And I'll talk to you probably in about a week about the actual storyline. Bye.